guys, we're rolling whenever you're ready.
Okay. I am Halivni for Toldo Israel. Today is February 11th, 2019. I'm sitting with J'ry Stern in Philadelphia, and he's going to be talking about his father, Harry Stern. Why don't you tell me, to start, when your father was born, where and when your father was born?
He was born in 1919, right here in Philadelphia, and grew up on the second floor of a tenement building at the corner of Broad and South Streets. And his father had a tailor shop on the ground floor.
What was his father's name?
Solomon. Zalman was what they called him. And he was European born. He was born in a village called Bukach in a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was cut. What do you cut
Yeah,
it
if you
into?
need to,
Yeah,
like,
yeah. I'm
stop.
trying to think of the name.
Yeah, no problem.
Oh, yeah. I just remembered it. Yeah. Okay. All right.
Don't worry about it.
All right. Just talk. Okay.
Remember, it's
Okay. Fine.
Yeah, very conversational.
Okay. You can put it back on. Is it on?
Yep.
Okay. Galicia was the province of the empire where Bukach is located, and it's now part of Poland. But the more well-known citizen of Bukach is Józef Agnon, the laureate, author laureate of Israel, and winner of a Nobel Prize in literature. I think the first Israeli, or the first writer in Hebrew, author in Hebrew, to win a literature prize from Nobel.
And where was your mother from? Yeah.
She was born in a small town called Felstein, a village in Ukraine, and her father was the Rav of the village. And she came here when she was 7 years old. Her father had been kicked out of the country because he was teaching Torah classes in his basement, which was illegal at the time under the Bolshevik rule. I believe that Ukraine at the time was part of the Soviet Union, and there was a nationalist movement there, which the leader was very anti-Semitic, and there was a pogrom in the town of Felstein, where my mother was from, killed scores of people, including my grandfather's first wife, and I believe 2 of his children. One of his children survived, and that was my Uncle Sholem. And then my grandfather remarried, and he had 4 more children, one of which was my mother.
Did you know your grandparents?
I did, yes. My grandfather, when he was asked to leave in 1924, came to Philadelphia because he had a cousin who was here and apparently had found him a job as a rabbi of a breakaway minyan, and it took him 4 years to earn enough money to pay for the tickets to bring over his family, his second wife, and 5 children. Actually, at the time was 4 children because, 3 children at the time came over. There were 2 that were born here. So that was in 1928 when the rest of the family came over.
And did you know your father's parents?
I did. I did know my father's parents. My grandfather lived until 1972, so I was 21 years old. Unfortunately, my grandmother passed away in 1959. She had a heart murmur, and in those days they had open heart surgery for some of what was considered minor heart problems, and she died on the operating table. So that was, but I remember her. I was 8 years old at the time, 9 years old.
so your father was born and grew up in Philadelphia?
He did until the age of 5, and he was a very active child, got into a lot of mischief, and at the time my grandparents had had a younger son, and I believe a daughter, and it was just too much for them to handle, so they needed a break, and they actually dropped my father off at his grandparents, who had a poultry farm in Woodbine, New Jersey, for a 2-week vacation, essentially. He ended up staying for 4 years. So from the age of 5 to 9, he basically lived in a farm community. It was one of the Baron de Hirsch communities that were founded in the United States, agricultural settlements, and it was one of the few successful ones. They had a factory there that manufactured uniforms for the military. And it wasn't through the agriculture that they survived, it was because they had a factory there, which was interesting lesson for Israel because, as you know, in more modern times, most of the kibbutzim that survive today are not because of their agriculture, which is the original intent of these kibbutzim, but because they had industry, some form of industry there. So my great-great-uncle, Mayor Rabinowitz, was the first mayor of Woodbine, and he was also the head of the factory. He was responsible for the running of the factory that made these uniforms. So my great-grandmother, who was his niece, had come over from Poland, and he had guaranteed her welfare, which is how she got over from Poland to Woodbine originally, my great-grandmother. And my father enjoyed those years on the farm because after having lived in very cramped quarters in a city, in Philadelphia, in a poor neighborhood, he had all this room to roam, and he considered it the best years of his youth.
Was his family traditional?
They were strict Orthodox. Yes, they were. In fact, his grandfather would get up at 4 o'clock every morning and learn for 3 hours before he went to Merion. And he was not a role model for my dad, though, because he didn't work. He was a scholar. He was Talmud Chacham, and the burden on making ends meet fell on his grandmother, and she basically ran the chicken farm and poultry farm, the poultry and egg farm, and they produced chickens and of course eggs for for sale outside within the Woodbine, but also they produced enough to sell on the outside. So my father was resolved not to place a heavy burden on his wife the way his grandfather had placed on his grandmother, and he had a strong sense of wanting to be successful and productive in some sort of job in the business. So in a way, he was motivated by his grandfather in a sort of negative way to go into business.
What languages did he speak at home?
He spoke Yiddish at home. He was fluent because that was the language that his parents spoke. But he had no accent because he was born here in the States, so he was bilingual. Although I remember him telling me that when he was in high school, he was required to take a foreign language, and so he took German because that was the closest he could get to Yiddish. And he told me, though, how much he hated it because of the association of the German language with the rise of Nazism and Hitler in Europe. but it was a requirement of the curriculum to take a foreign language, as it is in many high schools today.
Did he? Okay, so he grew up, and then till he was 9 or so on the farm,
Right.
and then.
And then he came back to live with his parents. And he attended public schools. He also attended Hebrew school it was called Gratz. It's at the time they were in North Philadelphia. They have since moved to the suburbs, but he would go after public school. I think it was 3 days a week, including Sunday mornings, to Hebrew school. And he was busy running around from one place to another. He also, at the age of 12, started working in his uncle's drugstore just to help make ends meet. His father was a tailor, but really scraped by. He had a tailor shop, basically was not a real profitable venture. And my father felt if he was able to, he would contribute to the costs of living expenses of the home, which he did from the age of 12, working in his uncle's drugstore, which is unusual. You don't see in Jewish homes. Maybe it was more common then, but today it would be almost unheard of for a 12-year-old to make money and turn it over to his parents to help pay for living expenses.
Did he go to college?
He did. He had a dual curriculum in high school. He went to Central High, which is one of the magnet high schools in Philadelphia. They have always had a selective admissions policy. At the time, it was an all-boys high school, and he had a dual curriculum in vocational and academic. So he was a busy guy, and definitely a type A personality. He did go on to Drexel Institute of Technology, as it was known then. And he went to night school so he could work during the day. And he eventually got an associate's degree in mechanical engineering. I believe that was in 1942, during the war.
Did he ever talk about do you know if there was still family that was left in Europe, or if they knew what was going on in Europe from?
They had family in Europe. My grandmother's, his mother's family was still in Poland. Many of them were still there. And my father actually would set aside, I think, a penny of his. He got 2 pennies for an allowance from his father every week, and 1 penny he would spend on, I don't know, whatever it was, his own thing. But he would set aside 1 of the pennies for tzedakah. And in the late 30s, there was an appeal from my grandmother's family in Poland that they had no money, and the Polish government was disenfranchising the Jewish community at the time. If you know a little bit about Jewish history, which I'm sure you do, in the mid-late 30s, the Polish government, which is anti-Semitic, allowed the guilds, the business guilds and crafts guilds, to push out Jews from all kinds of occupations, and the Jewish community became impoverished. They were not in good shape to begin with, but it got even worse. And so, without even thinking, my father just turned all of his pennies over. He had, at that point, collected thousands of them, and he had them sent to Europe to help his relatives in Poland.
World War II breaks out, and does he enlist? Does he serve in?
Well, what he did was, after he got his associates, or maybe while he was studying for the associate's degree, he was completing an apprenticeship in tool making at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. And it served a dual purpose. One, it got him a deferment from the draft. But secondly, it gave him a skill that he thought he could use in his career as a mechanical engineer. He told me that the exam just to get into this apprenticeship program was fierce, and the exam that they took, the competition, I should say, was fierce, and the exam that they took, you had to score 100 in order to get into the apprenticeship. If you got a 99 in your test, you were out. And the reason it was so fierce is he wasn't the only one who was looking for a deferment from the military. He wasn't doing it because he was unpatriotic. He just felt that it was an opportunity for him to acquire a skill before he could then give back something to his country. So he scored a perfect 100, and he did an apprenticeship there. And in 1944, he was assigned to the San Diego Naval Base because there was an effort by the Department of Navy to assemble a crew of tool designers who would be part of a team that would design and fabricate parts to ships that had been damaged in the Pacific Theater and had come back for repair. Until 1944, what the Navy used to do was a very short-sighted approach to repairing ships. They would basically cannibalize the damaged or missing parts of damaged of ships that had come back for repair in order to get those ships to be seaworthy again. Well, of course, what that would result in is disabling the ships that the parts came from. So it finally occurred to someone in the Navy that this is madness, and they decided they were going to produce and fabricate the parts so that they wouldn't have to cannibalize the parts from seaworthy ships. So my father was part of this crack team of tool designers, 15 or 20 of them, in San Diego Naval Base that took on this vital work in 1944. And in 45, when the list of recruits and draftees became depleted, my father was on a list of personnel that were going to be assigned to go out to the Pacific Theater for a combat assignment, essentially. But the order to be on that ship was actually countermanded by the base commander in San Diego because the work he was doing was so vital to the war effort, and the base commander basically took him off the list and said that he's too important here. But eventually he did get what they call placed on active duty. He was given a rank of first-class petty officer and was told to show up at a certain time, and I think it was in July, early July, he started the preparation for being shipped abroad. And I think a couple days before he was actually supposed to leave is when the Hiroshima nuclear bomb was dropped, and they put a hold on all ships going to the Pacific Theater at that point. And then eventually the war was over, and he didn't have to go. So he landed up never having to be on active duty, but at the same time, he gave the years during the war, he devoted them to the war effort here at home.
Do you know if his family was at all Zionist, or if they spoke about Zionism or Eretz Israel or Palestine, or?
They were Zionists. His parents were religious, but I would say they would probably be equivalent to what you would call today modern Orthodox. He definitely was instilled with a love of Israel from his childhood. He followed the developments of the yeshuv with great interest. I know that during the war, he also collected copies of whatever the name of the newspaper was, the Russian newspaper that was printed in English and available in the United States at the time. He collected them because he knew that reports of the slaughter of Jews in Europe would be more honestly reported in the Russian press than, or Soviet press, I guess it was then, as opposed to the New York Times and the press here. So he had a huge collection of Russian, of English language Soviet newspapers, which, if I could digress for a moment, during the Red Scare in the early 50s, he was so afraid that these papers would be found in our house. They were stored in the attic. He threw them out because he didn't want to raise any suspicion that he had any collusion with the Russians. Funny how things times haven't changed. But anyway, as far as his Zionism, he knew that the bulk of the people who would make up the Jewish state would come from Europe, and he was devastated by what was going on because he knew this was undermining the viability of the Jewish state, because so many of its potential population was being slaughtered in Europe. And of course, he had relatives there. Many of them were killed, uncles, cousins, aunts. He didn't know them because he was born here, but he saw the agony that his parents went through because it was their, they knew, his parents, who were both European born, knew who these relatives were. They knew them personally.
Okay, so the war's over. What does he do now?
Well, one aspect of my dad's life that I like to point out is, and one of the attributes to his success in life is that he was counterintuitive. He would, sorry about the phone, should have let it ring, or?
We can just wait.
All right. I wonder what happened to you. I saw,
Sorry, I was checking emails on my phone.
no, that's okay. I didn't know you were in the room because I couldn't even see you.
Working while I'm working.
Okay. As I was mentioning, one of the hallmarks of his success was that he was counterintuitive, and by that I mean he would do things that appeared to be the opposite of what made sense to other people. So when he came back from the war, he decided to start a business as a defense contractor. And people said to him, "Harry, are you crazy? The war is over. The last thing that the U.S. government needs right now is military hardware. What are they going to do with it?" And he assured them, he said, "Look, many of the war supplies have been depleted, and the government's going to have to restock all kinds of things that they ran out of because they used them up. And you never know, that there could be another war around the corner, and they have to have a warm base, be ready for that." So he was right about that, because as we know, it was less than 5 years later that we got embroiled in the Korean War. And so he started a business. He actually borrowed $3,000 from his father's life savings. But it shows you how much confidence his father had in my father, that he could be successful and that he could take the $3,000 that he lent him and turn it into a successful business. So my father also knew that his best shot at starting a business would be to locate it near one of the arsenals where the DOD manufactured and stored armaments. And the largest one in Philadelphia is the Frankfurt Arsenal, which is located in the Frankfurt section of Philadelphia. So he located his machine shop a few blocks away from this arsenal. And he started bidding on government contracts. And what he would do is go after the really small contracts, because he knew that the larger corporations, the larger defense contractors, wouldn't bother with the $200 and $300, $400 jobs. It was basically below the radar, and it wasn't worth it for them. They probably spent more money just preparing the bid package for the job than they would actually make on the job because of all their overhead. So my father started bidding on this really small jobs. So after a few tries, he was awarded one of these contracts. Now, he had two other partners with him, because the $3,000 he got from his father wasn't enough to get started. So he did bring in two other partners. So when they got the contract, the government, which is part of their procedure, told my father they were going to send over a couple of government inspectors to make sure that this was a legitimate business. And as you know from the movies and from books you may have read, there were a lot of profiteers and scam artists who were looking to turn a quick buck at the government's expense and were not legitimate enterprises. And World War II, of course, wasn't the beginning of that trend. That's been going on for quite a while. So the problem my father had was he had no equipment. He had a space that he had rented. Maybe he had one machine, but he didn't have anything which would indicate he had a viable business. So it just so happens there was a wood shop across the street from where his business was. Where I called it a business. It was basically a shop, a one-room shop. And he knew the owner of this wood shop. He had been friendly with him, being across the street, and they had hit it off, apparently. He asked the owner of this operation if he could borrow some of his machinery just for tomorrow. If he could have it, he could get some guys in and move the equipment into his shop, and then he'd return them the next day. So, he gave him a little bit of money, and I guess he paid whatever it was to have the machinery moved over. Now, these were things like bandsaws and punch machines. These were machines that were worked with wood. They weren't metalworking machines. But my father also knew that the government inspectors that would often be sent out to check out these things were not the brightest bulbs in the Department of Defense. And so sure enough, they show up, and they're looking around. And by the way, my father also paid the machine operators from the wood shop to come over and actually make it look like they were doing something. So they were busy working on whatever they were doing. And the inspectors apparently were impressed enough to think that he had an ongoing operation. So sure enough, he got the contract. It was a $314 contract, I think, the first one, to make some small widget. Well, they wanted 100 pieces. And my father sat down with his partners, and he said, okay, we're going to make 200 of these things. And they looked at him like, what do you mean we're going to make 200? The government wants 100. We're going to lose money if we make 200. He said, no, look, and this is part of his counterintuitive approach to life. He said, look, if we make the product according to specifications, they're going to like it, and they're going to order more of them. This is you and I know this is just a test lot, and there's a lot more behind them if we get it right. And the cost, I think it's, what is it called, marginal revenue product, I believe is the concept in economics, if I recall my Economics 101 from Hebrew University, that the incremental cost of the second 100 is a fraction of the cost of the first 100, because you don't have the setup costs and all of the cost to acquire the material. That's all amortized. So the cost of the second 100 is going to be a fraction. So my father made the point that on the second 100, that's where we make the money. So sure enough, a month or two later, government wanted another 100 of the same item. And that's where they made the money on that particular job. But in the meantime, they were bidding on other jobs and took the same approach. If the government wanted 200 of those particular widgets, he made 400. If they wanted 500, he made 1,000. And after a while, he was able to build up enough of the profit to buy out his partners. And I believe in 1953, so it took him about 6-7 years of taking this approach to manufacturing, where he was able to have enough success that he could run his own business.
What was the name? Was there a name?
Action Manufacturing Company. Action, yes. And eventually it became a complex of 6 factories located in 2 different states, in South Jersey and also southeastern Pennsylvania. And at its peak in the early 80s, he employed 1,200 people.
Okay, so he's got his business now, and he's starting to win more and more defense contracts?
Yeah, so let's go back to, do I have to, are you stopping?
No, I'm just putting a battery in my monitor. You can
Keep going, okay. Because this, I'm going to get to the juicy part here. So let's go back to 1946. So he had completed a couple of these jobs with his partners for Department of Defense, and specifically for the Frankfurt Arsenal, which was, you can actually almost see the facility from the roof of his building. It was that close. Because of the business relationship with the Arsenal, my father got to know a couple of the people on the inside there, and they had some Jewish employees as well. There were a lot more blue-collar Jews, or there were a lot more Jews doing blue-collar jobs in those days than today. So it was rather common. At some point, my father was approached by an individual, and I'm assuming it was a representative of the underground, whether it was a Haganah or Irgun, I don't know. They knew that he had a business relationship with the Arsenal, and I was informed later that it was part of the, I don't know whether it was a Jewish agency or who it was in the provisional government in Israel, and Palestine, I guess it was then. There were people who were going around the United States looking for opportunities to acquire military hardware. Part of the reason was the British had an embargo on arms going to Israel, and I believe Czechoslovakia was the only country that was providing any sort of military hardware in 46, 47. And there was even an embargo from the United States at the time. So Israel had very few options as far as legal avenues for acquiring any kind of arms. And unfortunately and I say Israel, I mean Palestine, but the Yishuv. Unfortunately for the Jewish community in Palestine, there was no such embargo imposed on the Arabs. They had no problem getting weapons. So clearly there was Israel was at a disadvantage, and they were desperate for any avenue that could be opened. So I can understand the need to have individuals who were looking for opportunities to acquire arms outside of conventional channels. Anyway, so this individual contacted my father and asked him if he could help in any way in terms of the War of Independence. You know, the war that, I don't know if it was an official war then, but clearly there were battles with the Arabs going on, 46, 47. And they were in desperate need of help. And my father was fearful, as many American Jews were, and Jews outside of Europe, that a second Holocaust, no, I'm sorry, Jews all over the world at the time were afraid that a second Holocaust would occur just a few years after the first one, and that if Israel didn't acquire these arms to defend themselves, and I keep saying Israel, but of course I'm referring to pre-Israel, but if they couldn't acquire the necessary material, then there would be another mass slaughter of Jews so soon after the 6 million were lost. So they asked him if he had, as I mentioned, if he could help him in any way. So my father knew this Jewish employee at the Frankfurt Arsenal, and he asked him if there was something that could be done to help the Jewish community in Palestine. So he got back to my dad and told him that there was a warehouse with surplus ammunition. It was ammunition that was left over from World War II. The arsenal had little use for it because it was peacetime, and it was just taking up space on the floor. This gentleman that my father was talking to, I believe he was a foreman of the warehouse, so he had some authority over the operation. So he told my dad on a specific night he would leave a gate unlocked at a side entrance to the arsenal that was right opposite this warehouse, and then he would leave the warehouse doors unlocked as well. So it was late at night, and my father, he didn't drive the truck, but he was, I guess you would call it sitting shotgun in the truck. He didn't have a gun with him, but he sat, as a passenger in the truck. It was a large truck, driven by another Jew, and I believe I was told his name was Harry Silk, who interestingly was, it became a member of Har Zion Synagogue, or maybe was even at the time in Winfield, and the auditorium at Har Zion was named after, it was called the Harry Silk Auditorium. And interestingly also, when I graduated from the Hebrew Academy, the reception for my graduation in high school was held at the Harry Silk Auditorium. So it's interesting how life intersects and comes full circle. Anyway, the two of them drove to the arsenal. They went through the gate. They backed the truck into the loading dock of the warehouse, opened up the doors, which were unlocked, and they loaded up the truck to the hilt with this surplus ammunition. And they left undetected, closed everything up. I guess the locks were there, but they were just in an unlocked position, and they locked everything up and drove straight to the docks in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is known as a port, and there was a ship waiting for this, for the goods that were in the truck. And they unloaded the truck and put all the crates, the crates of ammunition, I don't know if they were crates or individual boxes, but whatever the containers were, and they loaded up the ship. Now, had I known about this story when my dad was alive, I would have asked him, Abba, did the ship ever make it to Israel? Because I knew there was a blockade, and 90% of the ships that would try to get through with the illegal immigration never got through, and the British, caught them. So I don't know whether the ship ever made it to Palestine. I'd like to think that it did, but I don't know. So that's the story.
That's amazing. That's,
Yeah.
Did he, do you know if he had other involvement with anything in Israel's early years in terms of
No.
any kind of legal or not, or any kind of...
No, I mean, it wasn't until, I believe Kennedy's administration, that the United States even agreed to sell arms to Israel. I believe under Eisenhower, they had reimposed the embargo. Now, I don't know whether it was during his entire term or whether it may have been after 56, after the Sinai campaign, which Eisenhower was furious over. But it really wasn't until in the early 60s that the United States could do any kind of sale, whether it's through the government, whether it was government sales or whether it was private sales with government approval. So in the 50s, there was really nothing going on between them.
What kind of equipment did your father's company produce?
Well, I have a brochure in the basement. I can bring it up. And if you want, I can show pictures of what he produced.
I'd be interested afterwards, but...
Okay. Well, he made, his bread and butter were actually the fuses. The fuse, which is spelled F-U-Z-E, not F-U-S-E, it's not the fuse that you light to make something explode. But the F-U-Z-E fuse is the cone of a missile or a rocket or a bomb that contains the brains of the projectile. It's the metal tip, and inside there are all kinds of electromechanical devices which control the timing of the explosion, whether it's going to be at a certain altitude or whether it's going to be impact with the ground. And he was a sole source for probably over 50 different types of fuses, which went on all kinds of missiles and projectiles. He also made, as I mentioned earlier, fire control instruments for tanks, and he also made plastic practice ammunition, which the government had been ordering from him in larger and larger quantities, but eventually they decided to make it themselves. But he actually got the government to switch over from live ammunition to, or I should say, metal and brass ammunition to plastic coated ammunition for training purposes, which was a lot cheaper than metal. The other thing that he was known for, probably more so than the plastic practice ammunition, was the grenade launcher. During the Vietnam War, Action Manufacturing had the exclusive contract for 3 years for the grenade launcher. I don't remember the model name, but he made tens of thousands of them over the years. I remember asking him whether the Vietnam War landed up being a more profitable time for him than peacetime, and he said not really, because during peacetime, if he was late on a delivery, the government would look the other way and they wouldn't enforce any kind of penalty. But during wartime, there were very stiff penalties if he missed certain deadlines on deliveries. And like any other business, things go wrong, and you don't always get deliveries on time. And he ended up paying some heavy penalties during the Vietnam War, and he told me that it wasn't any more profitable time for him than peacetime was.
Any other weapons that he was involved in? Any other?
Well, he made he did a lot of work for the larger contractors like Rockwell International and General Dynamics. So he made parts and components to larger items. One of the things that he manufactured for NASA, I think the only contract he had for them was the ejectors that were in the seats, the astronaut seats. So apparently they're tiny explosions that have to take place in very controlled explosions, which eject the astronaut from the seat. So that was a high-profile product. He didn't make a lot of money on it, but people were fascinated when we told them that he actually manufactured something for a non-military application.
Was there continued, that you were more aware of than that story? Was there continued involvement in Israel within the family?
Well, yeah, one thing he did, and I can bring the photo in, which would help. But can I bring a photo in from the other room? Yeah. It'll dovetail with what I'm about to say. It's attached to the wall.
Okay.
I mean, it's also on wires.
So maybe we'll take a picture of it afterwards.
Yeah, okay. All right, so I'll just tell you.
Yeah.
So in 1946, as he was trying to get his business off the ground, he also started the first chapter of the American Technion Society outside of New York. And my mother was first secretary. He was the president of the chapter. And ATS is essentially the American funding arm for Technion. And it was their fundraising organization. And my father knew at the time that there were many Jewish engineers who were ambivalent about the state of Israel. Something that people today don't realize, the Jewish community was not in any way unified on the issue of a Jewish state, an independent Jewish state. There were many who felt either opposed to it or were ambivalent about it, and they were not in favor for whatever reason. And my father knew that the Pintelayid in these Jewish engineers, he could appeal to them in a way that wouldn't be directly asking them to go on record as being Zionists. So he figured that they would be more predisposed to donating to an engineering school in Israel than they might be in giving money to the JNF or giving to some other Israel organization or Zionist organization like Pol Mizrahi or one of the other organizations that were considered strong Zionist organizations. And he was right about that, and he landed up being very successful as a fundraiser. And in 1953, there was an attempt made by the American Technion Society to start a Central Jersey chapter of the American Technion Society. So they held a parlor meeting in Princeton, and my parents were invited to attend, and they had the international director of the society in attendance as well, and the big draw was Albert Einstein, Dr. Einstein, Professor Einstein. At the time he was living in Princeton. He had retired recently as a professor, full professor at Princeton. And there's a photo in the other room of my parents on either side of Dr. Einstein that was taken at that parlor meeting. Now, I don't know whether the Central Jersey chapter ever got off the ground. I didn't follow up on that, but it was my father had some interesting conversation with Dr. Einstein at the time, and it was, and even then, people knew the significance of the work he had done. Dr. Einstein was also an ardent Zionist. He actually had been asked to be the first president, as you probably know, of Israel, and Chaim Weizmann was actually the second choice, so which surprised people today when they hear that.
When did your father ever go to Israel?
Oh, yeah, many times.
When was his first trip, do you know?
Well, I know that I believe it was in the late 50s, and one thing that he did, it's important to, I'm glad you asked me, because one thing that he did for Israel was he helped them set up their own fuse business, their own fuse industry. My father knew that Israel's survival was dependent on their not having to rely on outside sources. He saw what happened during the War of Independence, how difficult, how one country after another refused to sell arms to them, and he knew that Israel needed to have its own industry so that it wouldn't have to depend on other countries to supply them and depend on the political winds and which way the winds were blowing politically. And he was right, because we know, for instance, in 1968, de Gaulle imposed an arms embargo in Israel, and through the 60s, it was France, through their supply of Mystère jets and other vital supplies, that helped Israel defend itself. And now Israel's greatest friend was had now imposed an embargo on them. So during those years in the late 50s and the 60s, my father made many trips to Israel to help them set up a series of factories that would manufacture the fuses. And so today, Israel doesn't have to import any fuses. They can make their own bombs and missiles, and the original capability to produce their own came from the series of factories that my father helped them set up. He also brought a series of drawings of the fuses so that they would have working drawings how to manufacture these fuses. I don't know whether he had the blessings of the State Department, but he never had to pay a price for sharing this information with Israelis, with Israel.
When were you born?
1950.
And when did you spend time in Israel?
I did. In 1967, I remember I was part of a what was called the Har Zion Summer Study Tour. It was a synagogue in Winfield, the same one where the Harry Silk Auditorium is, that sponsored a citywide trip for Israel for students who were going into 11th grade. And that was a big summer when you go from 10th to 11th. I think that was the summer when these student trips were sponsored, because you were too old to be a camper at summer camp, but you were too young, to be in one of these, internship programs. So the summer tours would occur during that time, and this was in 60. So I was actually 16 years old, and I remember that late in May, when things looked really bad, May of 67. We weren't sure if our trip was going to be on or not. So when the Six-Day War broke out, we were told that the trip was off, and we were crestfallen because we had looked so much forward, and that was it was going to be my first experience there. Well, as we know, it was 6 days later, the war was over, and then in the middle of June, they said, well, everything's back on schedule, so you guys can, we got the go-ahead from the Jewish agency. And I went to Israel, and I got there on, I think, June 23rd, maybe 2 weeks after the 6-day war, and it was such a time of euphoria. You could just sense it, just getting off the plane. Everyone was just in an ebullient mood, and there was a certain feeling of vindication and a confidence, even a cockiness among the Israelis that I was told wasn't there before, or maybe it was, but it was kept below the surface. But clearly, Israel felt like they were on top of the world, and it was just an exhilarating time to be in the country. I did return in 1970. The summer of 70 was, there was a triennial choral festival, the Zimriya, held in Israel, and it was, so the summer of 1970, I was a member of Zamir Chorale of New York, and we were the official representatives of the United States at the choral festival of Zimriya. And then we stayed on, right after the Zimriya was what they called the Festival, which was I don't know if they still have it, but it was a music festival of classical music, and the Philharmonic Orchestra would tour throughout Israel. They wouldn't just perform in Tel Aviv, and the Jerusalem Symphony also. So we got to sing, as I mentioned earlier. We got to sing the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony under Zubin Mehta's baton, and we rehearsed with one of the great conductors of all time. And it was just such a privilege and an honor, to sing under his baton. It was just, again, it was for myself an exhilarating experience, personally, to have done that. And I stayed on after that summer to Hebrew University, where I attended the program for overseas students. It was my junior year in college, and when I came back to NYU, I was concerned about having all my credits transferred. I didn't want to lose any time from college. So I remember at the admissions office, the admissions officer reviewing my transcript, and he noticed that I had taken a year of college Yiddish. And he said to me, we cannot give you any credit for the college Yiddish because we don't offer Yiddish as a language at NYU. So I'm going to cross that off. I can't transfer those credits. And I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have to make up the time somehow and have to double up on some courses. He said, however, I do notice you took an Ulpan, and you took an advanced Ulpan. We'll give you 6 credits for that because we have a Hebrew department here, and we'll give you credit. So the credits that I lost for Yiddish, I was able to make up with the Ulpan credits. So that was my second time to Israel. And then I returned again in 73. Through my father's connections, I got a job with Shikun Avdim, which is one of the largest housing developers of apartment buildings and private homes in villas, as they call them in Israel. I had a job there as a draftsman. I was interested in entering the urban planning career, so it was work related to my professional interests, career interests. And that was the summer of 73. Also, the choral festival was going on then, so I was able to take time off from my job and participate in the festival as well.
How do you see the involvement that your father had with Israel? In the various different stories and different ways. How did that impact you? How did that impact you in the way that you look at Israel or think about Israel?
Well, one thing he inspired me to do was to be counterintuitive, to not go with the flow and go along to get along. And I took that lesson to heart. And I saw it in his decision to open up a business at a time when people told him that it was the least needed thing out there. And I learned a lesson from how he doubled up on the number of widgets. And he lost money on his first few jobs, knowing that he could more than make it up later when the government reordered. So I took that lesson to heart, and I think I applied it in a couple of situations in my own lifetime. I recall that in the late 90s, there were many families that were moving out of our modern Orthodox community here in Lower Merion because there was a lack of options at the high school level for their children, and they would move out to other communities that had modern Orthodox high schools. We had none at the time, so I took it upon myself to document all of the local high school students who were attending modern Orthodox high schools out of town, and spoke to a number of people, and I found there were about 60 students from this greater Philadelphia area who were attending out of town modern Orthodox high schools, and I tried to make a case for for starting a school here. So people kept telling me, "You're out of your mind. You don't know what you're doing. You're going to hurt all the other high schools that were here." And there were other high schools, but one was a community high school, Akiba Hebrew Academy, which I attended. It had no religious affiliation. And the other extreme was there was a Torah Academy boys' high school and girls' high school, which was more of a yeshivish hashkafa. And I thought that Northeast Philadelphia would be the best location for it, and people told me no one's going to make the trip from Lower Merion to schlep to Northeast Philadelphia because that's a middle-class neighborhood, and this is more of a middle upper class, and you're not going to convince parents to send their kids to Philadelphia once they move to the suburbs. They turn their back on Philly. They don't want to have to send their kids to a Philadelphia school. So, but I didn't take that. It didn't deter me. And make a long story short, in 2000, September, we had a freshman class of 15 students at Stern Hebrew High School, named after our family. And today there are over 100 students in the high school division, and the school has now changed names to Kohelet Yeshiva, and it has a K through 12. It will have a K through 12 program in the next couple of years. Right now there's a lower school with many of the grades, and the grades that we don't have will be there as in the next couple of years as we progress. So we do have, I believe, 225, 230 students in the school. So that's that was one thing I took to heart. And the other thing that I did, just to go back in time, when I was a student at NYU, I was very concerned about the assimilative impact of a secular university such as NYU on traditional students, particularly those who came from out of town and were dorming or living on campus. It was one thing if you were religious and you were commuting from Queens or Brooklyn to NYU. You went back to your home. It's another thing altogether if you're living on campus and you're subject to all of the pressures and the culture, the university culture, around the clock. So again, against all these naysayers, I decided that we were going to have Shabbat meals once a month to provide for an opportunity for those religious students who were on the campus to experience Shabbat together. And we had, and people told me, no one's going to show up. You're not going to get anybody to sign up. We had 23 students that came to the first meals at the Young Israel of Fifth Avenue and West 16th Street. That was in February. It was right around this time, 50 years ago. It was in February of 1969 that the first Shabbat meals were served at NYU.
Rabbi
Rabbi Wogelanter, that's right. I don't remember his first name. I just knew him as Rabbi Wogelanter. And he was very gracious in opening up his facility to the NYU students, and we had our meals there. I remember Crown Deli provided the food in Lower East Side, and they delivered, which made it a lot easier. And again, to make a long story short, there are now nearly 500 students, faculty, and staff who have dinners at the NYU kosher cafeteria at Weinstein Hall, which was the first dorm where I lived when I was a student there. So again, my father inspired me to undertake initiatives that I sense would be successful, irrespective of the discouragement that I got from other people. Another example is of how my dad inspired me. When he was involved with Technion, he later, after he founded the first chapter of American Technion Society, he became one of their more significant donors. And he donated some serious dollars to the institution. So much so that he was appointed to the Board of Regents of Technion, and he occupied some honorific positions as well with them, which gave him a sort of inside look of where the institution was going. So back in the 1970s, he was very disturbed by a trend that was going on within Technion. It was late 70s, early mid 80s. There were people within the institution who were pushing to prioritize the PhD program in engineering. And if you know anything about PhD with engineers with PhDs, they're overqualified to do most engineering jobs. And about the only job they're qualified to do is to teach engineering at the university level. So how many PhDs in engineering could Israel absorb? They only had, at the time, one engineering school. Now they have several, of course. So what was happening was all these PhDs coming out of Israel were making yeridah. They were leaving Israel, and they were taking jobs in places like London and Kansas and Australia, because that's where the openings were. So my father was distraught over the fact that here was a major institute in Israel whose raison d'etre was to train Jews and Israelis for the Israeli labor force, and part of their mission was also to encourage Aliyah, so that Jews would come from other countries, they would study at Technion, and they would stay. Well, by promoting this PhD in engineering program, they were doing the opposite of what their mission was. They were encouraging, in a way, not deliberately, but by default, encouraging yeridah and not aliyah. So my father was able to convince them that they were headed in the wrong way by creating the Harry and Martha Stern Continuing School for Continuing Education and External Studies. And it exists today on the Technion campus on Har Carmel, and it trains engineers mostly from outside of Israel who make aliyah, who don't have the kinds of skills that are needed by Israel. And they retrain them, and they get a certificate. And the rate at which they are placed, the rate at which they get jobs in Israel is 99%.
Wow.
I mean, it's virtually everyone coming out of that program gets a job in Israel if they want it. And the timing was exquisite, because it was a course in the late 80s and the early 90s that the hundreds of thousands of emigres from Russia came over, and this program was, it was tailor-made for them, because if you know how things were done in the Soviet Union, the engineers were trained to do one narrow area. So you, for instance, would have someone who came over who was a boiler engineer. All he could do was design boilers. He didn't know how to do, he or she didn't know how to design anything else except a boiler. So these engineers would come over from the Soviet Union, and they needed to be retrained because Israel could not use their skills. And they became a valuable asset to Israel because of this school that my father started. And the end result was that the president of the university, of the institute, came to my father and said that he was right, that the institute had lost its way. And when the institute saw how successful this continuing education school was, they backed off their PhD engineering program. It's still offered, but it doesn't have the priority that it had enjoyed before my father intervened. So just to follow up on that, when I was at NYU, after I had my success with the kosher cafeteria, he continued to inspire me to try to make a difference, that one person can influence and can make changes, and you don't have to rely on don't depend on others to do the job if you think the job needs to be done. So after the kosher cafeteria took off, I was asked to head up a committee to close NYU on the high holy days. So in the fall of 1971, we decided we were going to have a sit-in in the president's office, the president of the university. Now you have to keep in mind, this was during the Vietnam era, and sit-ins were let's call it an acceptable tactic used by the anti-war protesters. So we basically borrowed a chapter from the book of the anti-war protesters and decided we were going to apply it to a Jewish cause. And at the time, there were many complaints that I received. I was co-president of the Jewish Culture Foundation at the time, which was the predecessor to the Hillel campus. There was no Hillel there because the Jewish Culture Foundation was part of the university's charter, and they didn't allow any other Jewish organization to represent the Jewish students there. That's changed since, but at the time, there was only one organization. And I got complaints from many of the students who were never given the opportunity to make up for exams that they missed. If they were religious and the finals exams were scheduled on Jewish holidays, they were not given opportunities to take the exam, or if they were, it was just by luck of the professor, and they felt something had to be done. And there were also many faculty who didn't show up on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur because they themselves were religious, and not a lot of learning went on in the university. And back then, there were more Jewish faculty than there are today. So I remember calling the office of the presidency, the office of the president, to let them know that we were coming to sit in the office. And I remember the secretary to the president thanking me over the phone for giving her a heads up. And as I hung up the phone, I thought to myself, this is a crazy world. That here I am, an agitator, essentially, being thanked for disrupting, their office. So we went there in a very orderly fashion. As we know, Jewish groups are very well behaved, and we sat in the office. We made our case. A few weeks later, there was a special meeting of the Board of Regents of the university. It was held. It was not a public meeting. It was done behind closed doors, and the president announced that he was going to hold a news conference, press conference on on the decision regarding Jewish holidays. So I remember there were members of the press there. There were TV cameras. It looked like a public relations event. I mean, like a publicity event. And it was I was asked to get up and speak and address the president about the need to close NYU on the High Holy Days. So I spoke for a few minutes, and then the president got up, and he spoke about Columbia University's vote, which had occurred just a few weeks earlier. They had turned down a motion to close Columbia on the High Holy Days. And so we were crestfallen because we assumed that he was going to use this as a springboard to announce that they were going to follow suit and use Columbia as an example. Well, he said that we came to a decision, and the decision was based more on concern for the faculty members who were absent on the High Holy Days, and not for the students. It was as if he wasn't going to give in, so to speak, and make it look like he was caving into our demands. So we anticipated what he was going to say. So he said that they voted to close NYU on the eve of Yom Kippur, which is Kol Nidre, of course, the night school, the evening school. They would be closed on the day of Yom Kippur. And the first day, and the evening of Rosh Hashanah's first day, and the Rosh Hashanah day itself. He said, however, we are going to be open on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, and this is the part where it became very strange because he sounded like a Talmudic scholar. He said, the Reform Jews do not recognize the holiness or sanctity of the second day of Rosh Hashanah, and as a result, we are going to abide by the Reform rites, and we will be open on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And so the place just broke out. It was applause. We pat ourselves on the back. And I believe the headline in the student newspaper the following day was, 2 out of 3 ain't bad.
Okay.
That's it. I don't think I have anything else to say.
Fascinating and inspiring, and I have to tell you, like, again, I've heard many of these stories, and it's really just to be able to hear about the people who really did things that were against the law or very
Right.
gray, but did these things because there was some kind of we have an interview with Rabbi Lamb where he talks about some of the things he did, and he says sometimes there was a higher calling, and you have to you know that these are the things that have to be done, and it's really inspiring.
Yeah, I know that there was an organization, Agudat Israel was the only Jewish organization that I'm familiar with that actually flouted the law to save Jews during World War II. I don't know if they were connected with the, is it the UOR, Union of Orthodox Rabbis?
Well, Irving Bunim
Yeah,
was
right.
part of the Vadatzalah.
The Vadatzalah, right. Which was, I think, associated with Aguda,
Yes,
right?
but
Yes.
I'll tell you what's very interesting is that we interviewed Irving Bunim's daughter. She's
Oh.
still living.
I know, she's a relative of mine.
Oh, Hannah?
Chana is Adina Frager's, Adina Frager is Chana's daughter, who's married to my first cousin, David Frager. So I know the family. And I remember Mr. Bunim, when my cousin got married, he was still alive.
So she said that there was a disservice that was done to her father's memory. Because there's a book that's written about all the things that he did, and all of the Zionist stuff that he did is not in the book.
Oh, it's left out. I think, is it a book by,
It's by his son, by the son,
oh, the son,
Amos Bunim.
oh, okay, I remember him.
And
He left it out?
it was published, he was in more Aguda circles. So
Oh, they were concerned about making it look like they were doing things illegally.
and they were doing things that were helping bring for the state of Israel. But the father was close to Jabotinsky.
Yeah.
And so daughter in the interview tells
Right.
all these stories that didn't make it.
Oh, I see.
But it's really interesting, just about like all the things that the ways that they were involved.
I have a book by Ephraim Zuroff, by the way, if that name rings a bell.
Yeah.
So he wrote a book about the Vad Hatzalah,
Mhm.
and I have it here.
We live in Gush Etzion.
Okay.
He's in Efrat.
Oh, yes, you
He
know
was
him,
in
yeah,
Efrat.
yeah. So he wrote several books.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he got himself into some trouble because, and I admire him, but he attacked this whole idea of Das Yisrael.
Yeah.
As you know that the Orthodox rabbinate should not be questioned, in Europe, and they had the power. Some of them were in positions to save Jews, and they told their flock to stay put,
Yeah.
and he criticized them, and Ephraim got laid on the carpet by some of these rabbis but Yasher Koach to him for calling out the 800-pound gorilla in the living room. Anyway, that's
Thank you
what
very
they.
much.
Oh, don't forget, I want you to get a picture of the photo in the other room.
Thank you very much. Can we do that? All right, we're good.
In the late 70s, Uzi Gal, who was the inventor of the Uzi submachine gun, was looking to relocate from Israel to Philadelphia. The reason was he had parted ways with Israel Military Industries, also known as TAS, which is the acronym for the Hebrew words that mean Israel Military Industries. And he was on his own, and so he had some mobility. He wasn't tied down to living in Israel. And the reason he was interested in coming to Philadelphia is they had a daughter who had a severe physical disability, and there was a school in Philadelphia called the, I don't remember the name exactly, but the Institute for Human Behavior, I think that's what it was called. And they claimed to have a technique which could help their daughter progress, at least, and have some ability to eventually walk on her own. So Uzi Gal asked his former employers at IMI if they knew anyone in Philadelphia that he could apply for a job with. And they said, well, Harry Stern is our man in Philadelphia. So he reached out to my father and asked and he explained the situation and asked if he had room in his organization at Action Manufacturing for him. He was known, he had a worldwide reputation as a gun designer. The Uzi submachine gun had legendary reputation because it was the weapon of issue to the IDF, and everyone knew about the '67 war and the successes of the IDF, and sometimes people will attribute the success to the gun, not to the shooter. And of course, it works the other way too. People will often attribute the crime to the gun and not to the shooter. That's a conversation for another time. So my father was a magnanimous man and a charitable man as well. He really did not need a gun designer to work in his organization, but Uzi convinced him that he, meaning Uzi, had a gun that he was designing, and perhaps there was some application for this gun in my father's product line. Well, my father was doing it more as a favor to his customer, IMI, than he was to Uzi Gal in particular. And of course, it makes good business sense to keep your customers happy. So he hired Uzi as a consultant, and he worked in a drafting room among the other.
1 second, let me just
Okay.
swap batteries real quick.
It's not a long story. I'm like halfway through it. So Uzi Gal had a drafting table along with the other draftsmen that worked at Action Manufacturing. Well, word spread like wildfire that Uzi Gal was working for Action Manufacturing. And the next time my father went to one of his trade shows, a firearms wholesaler came up to him and said, "Harry, I heard that Uzi Gal is working for you." He said, "Yeah, he's designing a new gun." He said, "I don't know what I'm going to do with it when he does, but he's been working for us for a few months." So this individual, this businessman, said to my father, "You should get him to design a semi-automatic version of the Uzi." And he explained this wholesaler that the SMG, which is a submachine gun, could only be sold to law enforcement, military, and Class 3 license holders, which is a very small group of licensed firearms dealers. But it could not be sold to the public because it's a machine gun. A machine gun's not considered safe in the hands of a civilian. Whether it's an Uzi, or whether it's a product that's imported, or whether it's a domestic product, doesn't matter. If it's a machine gun, it can't be sold to a civilian. However, a semi-automatic version, which means if you pull the trigger, only one bullet comes out at a time, as opposed to a stream of bullets, which come out of a machine gun, that's considered safe and can be sold to a civilian. But you have to obviously modify the firearm to convert it from an fully automatic to a semi-automatic. So my father respected this individual. He was a Jewish wholesaler, happened to be, and was interested in Israel and interested in promoting Israeli products here in the United States. So my father called Uzi in the next day and said, when he returned back to this company from this trade show, he called in Uzi Gal and he said, "Uzi, I spoke to this fellow who I respect tremendously, and he thinks that a semi-automatic version of the Uzi would be a really good seller in this country because of your reputation and the reputation of Israeli firearms." And Uzi just laughed at my father. He said, "Harry, what would a civilian want to do with a semi-automatic version of the Uzi?" I mean, he thought it was nuts. He thought it was, to him, the gun is a submachine gun, and any other variation of it, it just wouldn't be an Uzi. So my father said, "No, I'm convinced. If this guy's telling me it's going to sell, I think my gut tells me it's going to be successful." So, look, Uzi was an employee of my father, and if you're the employee, you got to do what the boss says, right? So grudgingly, he abandoned, or at least set aside, his pet project that he was working on, and he started to come up with a design of a semi-automatic Uzi. Well, about a year later, the plans had been submitted, the drawings had been submitted to the BATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and they came back with a few revisions that they suggested, and then went back and forth. Anyway, it did get approved back in 1979. They approved a semi-automatic version of the Uzi. So my father went to Israel and with Uzi, and they presented the idea to IMI, and within a year they were already shipping the Uzis to a new company that my father had formed called Action Arms, which was a sister company to Action Manufacturing. So this company was strictly importation and distribution. It didn't do any manufacturing. Well, despite Uzis, yes, it was importing Uzis, submachine gun Uzis and semi-automatic Uzis, both. So at the time, Israel was selling the SMG, the submachine gun, directly to law enforcement. But now that they had a representation in the United States, we handled all the sales to law enforcement of the submachine gun, which it was an ongoing business, so to speak. Or it was a line that already was in place. We didn't have to create it. And we expanded it, but we didn't have to start from scratch. But the semi-automatic Uzi, when the gun magazines got wind of this, And of course, we contacted them. We didn't wait for them to contact us. We got publicity out on the fact that a semi-automatic version of the Uzi was going to come on the market. This was in 1980, 81. And we got written up in all the magazines. We have copies of them. They were on the cover of Guns and Ammo, the cover of American Rifleman, and all kinds of other widely read gun publications. To make a long story short, over the years, we sold over 100,000 semi-automatic Uzis. So much for Uzi Gal's initial impression that there's no market, wouldn't be a market for a semi-automatic Uzi. The Uzi spawned a number of variations. We had the Uzi pistol, the carbine, semi-automatic carbine, and I'm sorry, what's called the mini carbine rather, and of course the full-size Uzi. We later brought in the semi-automatic versions of the Galil rifle, which was a long-range rifle used by IMI, as opposed to the Uzi, which was more of a short-range submachine gun. And of course, we had to submit applications to BATF for semi-automatic versions of the Galil rifle, and we had three types of rifles. We had the 223, the 308, and the sniper, the Galil sniper. So just to, as a coda to the story, in the early 80s, the Uzi had become so popular that when President Reagan was elected, the Secret Service decided to test a number of weapons which would be used by the bodyguards for the president. And the mini Uzi, which was part of our line of submachine guns, we had the full-size SMG and the mini Uzi, and eventually the micro Uzi. But at the time, the mini Uzi was a concealable weapon which could be placed in the shoulder holster of the Secret Service agents. And they selected that particular firearm. And so during President Reagan's term, his 2 terms, his bodyguards were armed with the mini Uzis, which were purchased through our company.
Do you know what ever happened to his pet project that he wanted to work on?
No, actually, I think he eventually came out with it, but I don't know whether it took off or not. I believe that he had some interest from different parties, but if it ever got to production, it was not a big seller, put it that way.
Okay.
Right.
Great. Thank you.
All right. I'm sorry, I almost forgot.